Hi, everyone. It's Tina Ramirez, and I am very excited to have with me today a personal friend and somebody that I've gotten to work with over the years, Eric Treene. Eric has been working in religious liberty in this space as a lawyer for many years. I knew of him because he was the litigation director at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty when before I worked there, but it's a place that I worked as well. And so I had heard about how amazing he was. And at the time, he was actually working at the Department of Justice, where he was special counsel for religious discrimination. And he was there for 19 years under 4 different administrations. And so I first got to meet him when he was there and just learn more about the different types of cases that they're working on and how critical he was to really protecting religious liberty within our Department of Justice nationwide. And so he's worked on many different cases for many different communities and seen really a broad spectrum of what happens in America and how to protect and preserve the First Amendment and our fundamental freedoms. So I am really excited to have you with us today, Eric. And I know that that doesn't do justice to everything in your background, so we'll put it all on the website, but thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Tina. It's really fun to be able to talk to you about these issues.
And so now you're over at Catholic University and the Reformed Theological Seminary teaching, and I'm sure that that's much different than working in the Department of Justice. But I would love to just start out with you telling me a little bit about your role at the DOJ as special counsel. What did that entail? I mean, most people probably don't even know that that exists. And so what is that role for, and what did you do?
Yeah, back in the early 2000s, 2001, Alex Acosta was a senior official at DOJ, but he went on to be Department of Labor Secretary. But he had an idea that he said, Republicans need to be more proactive in the area of civil rights. And he identified 2 areas where he thought there could be, substantial progress. And one was human trafficking, and the other was religious liberty. So he created 2 special counsel positions, one for human trafficking and one for religious liberty. And I applied for and was hired for that position. The idea was to take various areas of jurisdiction that the Department of Justice already had, but that they were not exercising. For example, when RLUIPA was passed, it's a long acronym, but the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act was passed in 2000, which protects religious communities' ability to build places of worship and religious schools, as well as the rights of incarcerated individuals. The Attorney General was authorized to bring suit, but there was no enforcement program in place. So they wanted to bring in somebody who could develop that enforcement program. Same thing in education. Religion was one of the protected categories under the Civil Rights Act, under Title IV, but it was not exercised. And so they wanted someone to come in and take all these different areas where the Department of Justice did have the ability to bring suit and enforce these important provisions of law.
I didn't realize that Acosta had done that, and that both trafficking and religious liberty, which is fascinating, and that he really had the foresight to see how important it was to address civil rights issues. So,
Sure.
And then you were there through 4 different administrations. That's right. And they all protected these. So how did that change from administration to administration? Did they all see the value in these 2 civil rights? Did they treat them the same? How did that work?
Yeah, so there's certain areas that are within our sort of direct enforcement jurisdiction. And that's where you don't see that much change from administration to administration. Once we set up the RLUIPA enforcement program, we're taking cases from Muslims, Christians, Jews who've had their rights violated, and we enforce their rights. And that's not something that changes from administration to administration. Sometimes there might be more resources or less resources depending on other priorities, but that goes on. Title VII, the employment discrimination and the obligation of employers to accommodate religious observances and practices. In fact, just because of the cases we had coming in, I would say, the Obama administration, the first couple of years of that was particularly active in protecting the rights of bus drivers and subway drivers to wear religious clothing, including a Pentecostal woman wearing a skirt and Muslims wearing headscarves and so forth. So that doesn't change. The area that changes is in the filing of briefs in support of private litigation. We're allowed to file briefs. It's called statements of interest in the trial court, and then amicus briefs in the Supreme Court or the courts of appeals. And that's one area where, for example, the Trump administration, we were very active on school choice, the Espinoza case at several different levels. The case that's coming up to the Supreme Court this term, Carson v. Macon, about school choice in Maine, we filed there in the trial court and the Court of Appeals, laying out for the court that discriminating against parents who choose to send their kids to religious schools, and disfavoring them, but favoring parents who chose to send their children to private secular schools violates the Constitution. So that's one area where there's a little more ability to make policy decisions. And so just over the last 4 years, we were particularly aggressive in those cases, in cases involving equal access for example, student religious groups in colleges to be able to meet and choose leaders who represent their views. So those things change. And then the one thing that never changes is crimes against places of worship. All the administrations that I worked with were very dedicated to protecting places of worship when they faced vandalism, arson, attacks. That is an area that has been consistently a priority at the Department of Justice.
Well, I want to have you explain a little bit more about RLUIPA and about those cases later. But first, let me just ask you how you got involved into practicing religious liberty law.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to people who are into religious liberty law, one common thing is they tend to be either people of faith or people with maybe a strong libertarian streak, but generally people of faith. And I am a person of strong Christian faith, but that's never enough. If you start talking to people, there are a lot of people who go into law who have faith, and they go into all kinds of different areas. But for me, it came during law school where I was always interested in this kind of law, but I was just struck in our constitutional law class when we shifted from free speech to freedom of religion. It just seemed like all of my classmates who were so leaning forward, excited, were just kind of like, when are we going to get past this stuff? It was just a real apathy about the case. And even one case that we studied involving Native Americans, the Ling case, you might have known about. A road was being built in federal parkland, and Native Americans said, "Well, this is going to interfere with some sacred lands. Can't you build it over here?" And the Supreme Court basically said, "Well, no, it's the federal government's land. There doesn't have to be any balancing of religious rights versus the government's rights." And I said, "Wait a minute, maybe the Native Americans ultimately lose if the government has a good reason, but doesn't the government have to show some reason for violating someone's religious rights? That just doesn't seem right." But I was the only student in a class of 150 who saw any problem with that. And so that, for me, I just said, there's something really wrong here, and I need to look into this. And so I started to become more interested in religious liberty law, and kind of went from there.
So, Eric, you went to Amherst College and then to Harvard Law. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's fun because I actually used to live in Amherst, Massachusetts. I didn't realize you lived
lovely
there.
town.
Yeah, I love it. Antonio's Pizza and everything.
The leaves changing in the fall. Yeah, gorgeous.
Beautiful, beautiful. I mean, and there's all of those colleges are right around there, the 5 colleges. And and then you have Jonathan Edwards, who led the Second Great Awakening, like literally right down the street in Northampton, or right down the street. So yeah, it's a pretty amazing place. But, and then Harvard Law, I'm shocked that even, 25 years ago or whatever it was, that you were having those kinds of conversations in your law class, but it seems like those are the same kind of conversations happening today, and that really you reflect a lot of the cases you've dealt with in this past year with COVID, is that there's this lack of understanding of why religion is important to people and should be a specifically protected right, even though it's in our First Amendment. So can you explain, before we jump into COVID and what happened last year, a little bit about why religious liberty is so critical, not just as a sacred human right, but in American, constitutional law? Like, why is this so important?
Yeah, well, in the 90s, when I started getting into this at the Becket Fund, it was really the very beginnings of the Becket Fund, just a couple employees. Now they've got, who knows, 30, and there are lots of groups like the Becket Fund out there. But it was really a quaint little area of law. But I think as some demographic forces have gone on, America's become more diverse. I mean, if you look at Muslims, there were virtually no hate crimes against Muslims in the 1990s and before. There were virtually no disputes about building mosques and such. And then suddenly, as they grew in numbers, and then you had 9/11 and the visibility of that, suddenly was an issue. Sikhs in America, not much of an issue early on, but you've got lots of more people with employment and conflicts. And then among Christians, you see sort of a fracturing where you go to the 1950s and 60s, and there was sort of this cultural Christianity that was dominant. And so people had, you had some Bible readings here, you had Sunday closing laws, everyone kind of agreed on sort of a base level of religion in public life. But that has fractured. So you have some people who are not religious, some people who are religious, but kind of leave it for Sundays. And then you have the growth of evangelicals who bring their religion with them throughout the week and into their employment and so forth. So you have all these factors of diversity within Christianity, diversity of many religions, causing free exercise to be a much larger issue today.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating that it is so much more religiously diverse, and yet the secular community is that much more hostile to the religious sentiment and to that being prioritized in any way in law. Can you explain a little bit about why religious liberty in particular is protected constitutionally? Why is that so important?
Well, I mean, in America, we have the First Amendment, and we often call religion the first freedom. It's the first right mentioned in our Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's fundamental to the right of conscience. You can't have a notion of conscience without religious conscience, the idea that you can believe and act on those beliefs. It's really just very fundamental to who we are as humans, and in America, who we are as Americans bearing rights that are set forth in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to tell you a fun connection with RLUIPA in a minute, but first let's talk about the pandemic, because
sure.
I think this really kind of exemplified for me how far we've gone in our country, where people really just treated religion like something that could, anything in our culture that could just be let go for a time period, or just I'm not using the words correctly, but it was like a luxury that we didn't always need.
Right.
And I think it just was shocking to me to see and hear conversations about, even in a pandemic, you can let it go, because the way I had always understood it is that religious liberty is something you don't even lose if you're in prison. And so how is it that we've gotten to the point in our society where now it's a luxury that, we can dismiss when it's inconvenient, or there's, major health concerns? And I understand that health can be, that freedoms can be limited for health reasons. But throwing the baby out the bathwater doesn't really make much sense to me. So
no, I think you're hitting on some. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on what was the real problem with the pandemic restrictions and why there was such a backlash against it. Because when you get down to it, there were secular choices about things that are necessities that are more important than religion. And there were necessities beyond food, pharmaceuticals, and sort of the hardware you need to keep your house going, keep your heat on. Things like in Virginia, dry cleaning was favored over. So we had one case at DOJ in Virginia where there was a church. It was a 225 person church. They had a 16-person service. It was for homeless and people kind of on the edge with substance abuse and so forth. So they really needed to meet in person. But the limit was 10 in Virginia. So they were, of course, were fine. But we looked at it, and you could have non-retail store businesses could operate. So as long as they did 6-foot distancing. Dry cleaners, And you say, well, wait a minute, dry cleaner, that's a necessity, but is it really? If you talk to a religious person, you'd say, are you willing to wash your clothes out in the sink and be a little wrinkled and be able to go to church, or not go to church and have perfect dry cleaning? I think a lot of people of faith would say, yeah, let me be rumpled. But that's a policy choice that Virginia was making. They also were keeping liquor stores open, which you understand some people would be alcoholic and could go through withdrawal symptoms, but that's a real minority of the people who are using liquor stores. Same thing in Mississippi, right? So we represented a pastor who could not go online. He was in a poor church. They didn't even have a website, but they did get hold of a low wattage broadcasting system. You can probably get them for like $100 or so. And so they had the cars in the parking lot with the windows rolled up, and they were tuning in to listen to the pastor who was in front of them preaching. Well, if you go down the street, that was forbidden. But if you go down the street, you could go to Sonic and do a drive-in restaurant. Now, again, food is important, but you don't need to go to Sonic and have a burger cooked for you. You can eat beans from a can. And frankly, people of faith would just as soon eat beans from a can and go to church than be able to go to Sonic. But again, it was a policy decision where they favored a certain use, drive-in restaurants over drive-in churches. And so we actually won in that case and won in the Virginia case. And this happened really all over Nevada. You had a 50-person cap for churches, but then casinos and restaurants could be open as long as they limited their capacity. I think it was 50% and did distancing, but churches were not allowed to do the same 50% capacity and distancing.
I speak to youth groups, and I remember in one youth group, somebody talking about the Hobby Lobby, or it was either the Hobby Lobby case or it might've been a Hosanna Tabor. And I remember, I think it was in Hosanna Tabor, where the Obama administration argued that religious organizations were no different than Elks Clubs or labor unions and shouldn't be treated differently, that they should be under the same non-discrimination laws as others, even though if you're a part of a religious organization, you hire and fire based on your religious beliefs. I mean, you wouldn't hire a pastor that doesn't abide by your beliefs. It just wouldn't make sense. But that same kind of logic seems to be what we're hearing about throughout the pandemic, that, you're no different than a labor union or an Elks Club, or even worse, you're just not even as important as a labor union or an Elks Club. You're not essential. And I think for religious people and it's not just religious people, but religion and conscience for non-religious people, but for everyone, are essential. And I think that's what's so shocking about what happened, is that it was treated as a non-essential when it is.
Right.
And we now live in a society where the Obama administration's position on Hosanna Tabor was rejected 9-0 at the Supreme Court. But now we have an entire culture that lived through this pandemic and thought it was okay, and it was enforced by law, where in all of those cases you mentioned, churches and individuals were fined, taken to court. And even if you look at the California cases and the way they fought, it's crazy to me. Just how is there so little understanding of these basic freedoms in America today?
Yeah, the craziest one we saw was San Francisco, and their churches were limited to one person at a time. I guess the idea was that you could come in for counseling or come in for confession one at a time through the door. At the same time, retail was allowed to operate at 50% capacity with 6-foot separation. And these churches, a large church would say, hey, we'll be happy to operate at 50% capacity with 6-foot spacing. You had gyms open with 6-foot separation, tattoo parlors, hair salons. Again, is a hair salon essential? It's part of your daily life, right? But would a person of faith forego a haircut for being able to go to church? Most certainly.
Yeah, it's not even that they're being treated as non-essential, but they're actually being penalized for existing, and just trying to compete on an equal playing field, which is even worse.
Right. And people said, well, you can't go to movies, so you can't go to church. Not realizing that churches or synagogue or mosque is essential in the same way that a dry cleaner or a hair salon, or even more so would be.
So the Department of Justice got involved in these cases, and argued that several states were violating the rights of individuals to worship in their attempts to curb the spread of COVID-19. And then you argued that some of the restrictions were imposed unequally on non-religious gatherings with similar impacts on public health. Can you tell us a little bit about how the equal treatment principle and how you legally approach that? And I know in California you intervened in one of the things when they were issuing some mandates, and Newsom had to actually revise his proposals because of that. Can you tell us about that?
Right. Yeah, it's the idea that a religious use must be treated at least as well as comparable uses. So there are some distinctions between, say, a church and a grocery store, right? Because in a grocery store, you're really only in contact with any individual at say a 6-foot distance for a brief period of time as you're passing each other and so forth. It is true that in a church you are often in the same proximity as a number of people for an hour perhaps for worship, and so that might arguably create different risks than say going to the grocery store where you're just passing people left and right. But what some places like we are in California did, they allowed people in restaurants, they allowed people in movie sets and such, right, to be in the same vicinity for periods of time comparable to places of worship, and yet churches were not allowed and other things were. This came to a head with the Brooklyn Diocese v. Cuomo case in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said that since New York had a hard cap of 10, no more than 10 people at a church, synagogue, or mosque, or other place of worship, but would allow laundromats to have more people, would allow to have manufacturers of certain kinds of manufacturers to have people, working in close proximity. The court said, no, you have to treat religion at least as well as these other things that had comparable characteristics. So if the government's really concerned about people in the same place for a period of time, like an hour or more, they have to treat all places where people congregate for an hour or more the same way.
Well, it seems pretty basic, but in your interactions with the states, on behalf of DOJ, did they just not get it? Like, what was their response? Like, how did they
different reactions. I think, Governor Northam in Virginia was actually, we sued on a Sunday. I remember I worked all day and we filed this emergency brief on a Sunday night, and Monday he had a press conference thanking DOJ for pointing this out and making some corrections. So, it's nice to have that kind of response from government officials sometimes. Other times, people you would let it go to court, as would happen in Brooklyn, for example, with Cuomo. But generally, we had a pretty good response. Like the Mississippi case, we were dealing with the local government. The governor ended up speaking out in favor of our position, and then the city caved after that. So I do think there's some degree of a learning process. So especially early on, in the first few months, as people were feeling out, okay, what should we be doing to control transmission of this very dangerous disease? But then sort of realizing, okay, there's some areas where we've really gone overboard here and restricted a fundamental freedom.
Yeah. Can you talk about the San Diego case with Newsom, the United Pentecostal Church versus Newsom?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting case because that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that 5-4, that California's restrictions were okay, even though they treated restaurants better than places of worship. Then we had the nomination of
Amy Coney Barrett.
Amy Coney Barrett, yeah. And so that flipped the court. And so in the Brooklyn Diocese case, the court came out the other way. So it just shows you how difficult a question this is, how hard cases make bad law, is an old saying in the law, that when you have something like a pandemic, people want to defer to the government. But then as the dust settles, you start to realize that there are important legal principles at stake. And I think eventually that came around. Plus, having another vote on the Supreme Court didn't hurt either.
Well, I think that that point is very well said, because I know in our work overseas that whenever we're meeting with persecuted groups, they always want to say, can you just stop this, make a law against it, do this and that. We always have to remind them, hey, in a time of crisis, if you're making laws, you have to live with them forever. And you might think that it helps your community now, but it's actually going to have these negative impacts on your community once implemented later. And so I think, that's obviously always something to consider. But at the same time, I think just the biggest, factor in all of this was that there was so little understanding. I mean, you're talking about Mississippi, that should be like the Bible Belt, that didn't get religion. And then obviously California, which everybody knows doesn't get religion, and like, New York, which we get. But I mean, you had Cuomo discriminating against synagogues all across New York. And I mean, he got sued for that as well. That was a big case. I mean, they were specifically targeting and discriminating against synagogues in the Jewish communities that couldn't even meet. I mean, I'm just shocked that people don't get religion or why it's so valuable. To me, it's just the one thing that I think was really eye-opening of how far we've come as a nation, that we just don't understand it as a fundamental first freedom, like you said.
Right. And so many people saw it as an add-on to your life that you could easily, pull off for a while, come back in a year,
Yeah. And it used to be something you live and die for, something that, during even the Holocaust, that people, it gave them the hope to continue, was their faith. I mean, I know people that are tortured and persecuted around the world, their faith is worth being persecuted for, but it's also what gives them the hope to keep going. And in a time of crisis, even more so. And so it's shocking that we've gotten to that kind of place in our society. So anyway, it'll be interesting to see how the courts handle it. But I think that the good kind of wake up moment for us is that, courts can change. And like you said, you had two different opinions, and the makeup of the courts matters. But, as the culture changes, so will the courts. And so we really need these ideas to be embedded into the culture. And obviously that's what we do at Hardwired. But when you were at DOJ, you worked on RLUIPA, and you also worked on a number of other issues, which I want to talk about in a minute, of actually going and educating communities about their rights. So I want to come back to that in a minute, but let's talk about RLUIPA. Can you tell us first, what is RLUIPA?
Yeah, so it was a law passed in 2000. Coalitions, it was a unanimously passed law, and Congress was trying to pass a law to protect religious freedom, and there ended up being some divisions over some broader proposals, but they settled on two areas that everyone could agree on. One was protecting places of worship and other uses of land, like for religious schools or faith-based social service providers. The ability to locate, to rent property, or build in a community. When people were faced with discrimination, or often towns would want a Walmart instead of a church in a certain location, and so forth. So that was a big boon. And the other part of it was protecting people with in institutions. So prisoners, people confined in mental institutions or state-run nursing homes, and their ability to exercise their. It was passed unanimously in the year 2000.
Which is important given our very partisan, environment right now. But I smiled when you mentioned Walmart, because I actually attended Cottonwood Christian Center, which was one of the first big RLUIPA cases that the Beckett Fund took.
It was a Costco, though, not a Walmart, right?
It was a Costco, yeah, and one. But yeah, you're right. It was a Costco, which I love Costco. But so essentially all over California, they were blighting areas and then giving them to businesses to do with what they wanted. And they tried to take away the land of Cottonwood Christian Center, which it's funny because when I was a member there, they would talk all the time about this property they were going to be building on. And it was a big part of it. They were raising money. And then all of a sudden the land was going to be taken away. It was like,
what happened here?
For a Costco. And they're like, well, wait a minute. So they ended up in this fight. And, I mean, it was really RLUIPA that protected their ability to not have their land just discriminatorily blighted and taken from them, but to be protected so that they could build their church on that land. But a lot of people don't understand, I think, today, RLUIPA and why it's still valuable. Can you talk a little bit about how RLUIPA has been useful in some of the cases you've dealt with at DOJ?
Yeah, so there's basically three different types of RLUIPA cases. There's non-discrimination. You can't discriminate because you don't like a particular faith. This came up after 9/11 with a number of mosques. It continues to be an issue with Orthodox Jewish communities in New Jersey and New York, and occasionally with Christian faiths. Like you'll have a Pentecostal church, and people think, hey, we've got enough Christian churches here. We don't need Pentecostals coming in, and you get some of that going on. So that's one type of case. And those are the easier ones, right? When there's naked animus, as we call it. The other is treating a religious assembly worse than a non-religious assembly. So that's where cases, like we had one in St. Anthony, Minnesota, when I was at DOJ, where a mosque tried to move into a place. It would be fine if there were a union hall or a convention hall or an assembly hall, but because they were going to use this pre-existing building for prayer gatherings, suddenly that wasn't allowed under the zoning code. We ended up winning that case. So those are what we call equal terms cases. And the third kind of case is a little trickier, but it's where the government imposes a substantial burden on your religious exercise. Not just an inconvenience, but a substantial burden. I guess Cottonwood would be an example, right? They're taking your land. That's a substantial burden. At DOJ, we had a case recently in Woodcliff Lake, New Jersey, where a synagogue wanted to expand, and every time they tried to buy land, the government would come in and rezone it for condominiums, or the government would come in and buy it from underneath them. And then finally they said, okay, we'll do it on our existing land. And the government said, oh, we deny that permit because this little problem, that little problem. So he said, no, this pattern is a substantial burden on their ability to exercise their religion. And it's an interesting, I mentioned Orthodox Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Those are the three largest categories. I think partly because some discrimination on the Orthodox Jews and Muslims, but also these are three groups that are expanding. You have evangelicals doing a lot of church planting. You see sort of a shift from neighborhood churches to more regional churches. You have a shift in Christianity to trying to be in locations, in shopping malls and so forth, where people are. And then you have mosques, which are, you have a growing population of Muslims in the US. Then you have Orthodox Jews who are, especially relative to other parts of Judaism, are growing because of large families and some demographic changes. But those are the areas we saw the largest number of cases. In fact, Muslims and Jews made up 55% of all the lawsuits we filed at DOJ when I was there. A lot of the Christian cases, when DOJ threatened to sue, we'd send a letter, they'd back down, or we'd open an investigation, they'd back down. But with the Muslims and the Orthodox Jews, they often don't get it, they want to fight, and they fight, and they ended up losing, and it cost them a lot of money. But
Eric, one thing people often, I think, have a misperception of is that religious liberty is often just an evangelical, issue, but really it's essential for so many different communities, and even people that are of no faith, or some very different faiths that believe, religious communities that you wouldn't even imagine. So can you just share a little bit about the importance of how diverse your work was at DOJ, and in helping people understand the importance of religious liberty for everyone?
Yeah, well, if you look at the area of employment, really the largest number of cases you have in employment are Sabbath accommodation, which ends up being Saturday Sabbath. So you're talking about Jews and Seventh-day Adventists would be the major plaintiffs there. You also have people with beards, which would be Muslims and Jews, head coverings, Sikhs and Muslims. So those are really, in employment, the big areas. And then in land use cases, as I mentioned, Muslim and Jews were 55% of the cases. So yeah, it really is something that cuts across religious lines. In hate crimes, Jews make up the largest group of victims, then Muslims second, and then you have Christians, Sikhs, and others below. So yeah, these issues are really important to minority faiths in the U.S.
Yeah, and you did a lot of work, didn't you? I remember seeing your reports often from DOJ. You weren't just doing litigation in these cases and supporting these communities that way through DOJ, but you also did educational kind of gatherings and seminars with communities, diverse communities across the U.S., didn't you? Was that educational part of what you did?
We did it domestically and internationally. So domestically, we work with a lot of different communities to educate them on their rights. We did training sessions for religious communities on keeping, with the FBI and Homeland Security, on protecting places of worship from attack, active shooter, arson, protection measures, and so forth. And internationally, we had a program in conjunction with the State Department and Homeland Security where we went to other countries and talked about the challenges and tools, the challenges we had, and then the tools we had legally to combat discrimination in the U.S. And I still remember one of my favorite exercises was one that I cribbed from Hardwired. We always put at the bottom, that this is used with permission, but it was where we talked about sort of 4 different areas of people who could advance religious liberty. What could the individual do? What could nations do? What could non-government organizations do? What could the international community do? And it was a great way to get people talking. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. It's very simple, just one chart. But I think it's fascinating because you're right. Some of the things that we see overseas, most people, when they think of like religious persecution around the world, they think of big cases like blasphemy or apostasy or, very religion related cases, but it's actually often people being discriminated in the use of their land for building churches, over their identity cards and legal rights to do certain things, employment discrimination. It's actually all the things that you're talking about. And so doing this kind of work internationally is not as difficult as people would want to. It's not like you're going and you're trying to challenge this, major genocide or a government. It's actually little forms of discrimination that create the worst just intolerance in a society or causes for persecution. And I think, and that's usually not what gets the attention of the media, but that's actually the most important thing to address. And so what you're talking about and what you're doing, from what I've seen, is really like that foundation of what they need more than anything. And it's simple. It's just understanding, why is religion valuable? Why is, when you're in societies where you have one dominant religion, and you have minority groups, helping them understand why that minority perspective is in their interest. And here in America, as you mentioned, you are helping the minorities. Like the Jewish community is one of the smallest religious communities, not just in America, but in the world, and yet disproportionately the most persecuted. And so, we often say, like, how you treat that minority is indicative of your respect for these freedoms more broadly. And so I think that example and that perspective for those communities is, it's so valuable in the work that we've seen around the world. So
yeah, I remember being in Malaysia, and you had the Muslims complaining that the Chinese, who were the controlled a lot of businesses, discriminated against them in employment, and then the Chinese were saying that ethnic Chinese who are Malaysian citizens complaining that the Malaysian government discriminated against Chinese in favor of Malay people who are Muslim. And I said, well, actually, in the United States, we have one law that applies to whether it's government discrimination or private sector discrimination. It's the same standard. It's Title VII, and here's the law. And they're like, that's interesting. Wow, the same law. I haven't followed up to see if, maybe they've moved in that direction. But, it planted the idea. It was sort of like that aha moment that, wait a minute, we could get through a law that would protect these two very different sides of, in this sort of group conflict, and maybe get some traction. So you never know.
And you don't have to change the Constitution to do it, which in most of those countries, that's what they think has to happen. And then it takes forever and they never get there. And it creates so many, inter-party conflicts and things in those countries, but just helping them understand and see things from a different perspective. And I think even in America, from what I've seen, these kinds of conversations are essential to help people understand, hey, if you don't want that mosque built or that Sikh to be able to use their kirpan or X, Y, and Z, then that means you're not going to be able to wear your cross. You're not going to be able to build your place of worship in this place. I mean, everything that happened during the pandemic is a perfect example of why we need to, as a society, understand these rights for everyone, even the minority, even people we don't agree with, and defend them. So Eric, tell me just one more topic before we get to hate crimes. School choice. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you did on that at the department? And you mentioned some cases. Were you referring to the Blaine amendments when you were talking earlier? And if so, can you describe a little bit about that? There was a major Supreme Court case last year that I thought kind of settled this. Is that still in play?
Yeah, so in the United States, there was a big push for school choice, and that came in the Zellman decision. What was it, 2001, 2002, something like that, where the idea that it didn't violate our separation of church and state to have the government provide funds that were religion neutral. It didn't give them to religious schools, it gave them to parents, and the parents could then choose to use it for a religious school or a secular private school, or to go to a neighboring public school and use the funds for any of those purposes. And it's the choice of the parent, not the state. That was sort of step one. Then the question became, what if the government had a program where they gave benefits on a neutral basis like that, but then didn't the government chose not to, for some policy reason, allow a religious religious parents to use it for religious school. And that's sort of the way you're saying the Blaine Amendment, because there were these laws and state constitutional provisions passed in the 19th century. And the idea is that allowed under our free exercise clause, the idea that you cannot deny someone the free exercise of religion. So we had this case that came up involving tax credits in Montana. Espinoza was decided last year, and the Supreme Court said you could not have a program that excluded religious school parents from using this credit for that purpose. But now another issue is coming up before the Supreme Court, where what's happening is the state of Maine is saying in this case, Carson v. Macon, that they're not saying religious schools can't get it. If you're a school that says you're a religious school, that's fine. We're not going to discriminate based on your status, but we don't want any religious content. So if your curriculum has religious things in it, that is a religious use of the funds. It's not the fact that you're a religious school and we're excluding you because of that status. It's because your curriculum has religion in it, and the secular schools we want to fund don't. We had argued at DOJ below in the district court and the Court of Appeals that this violates free exercise, that the choice is left to the parents, and so as long as you're getting, as the government, reading, writing, arithmetic, and the basics that you set forth as the requirements of schooling. And actually in Maine, it includes Maine history, American history, world history. And the religious schools teach all of those things, but they also incorporate religion into the curriculum. That's their choice. And as long as you're getting the same bang for the buck, as long as you're getting those basic things that you lay out, you can't say, well, you're not allowed to use these funds because you're also putting religion into the curriculum.
That's amazing. So that one's coming out soon. Has it already
been? I think December 8th is the argument. So another month.
No, that's going to be interesting. So going back to hate crimes,
sure.
I mean, as you said, the Jewish community has been disproportionately affected by hate crimes. I remember just before the pandemic started, there was that major attack on a synagogue, or not on a synagogue, on a rabbi's home up in New York or New Jersey. That was pretty horrific. And then there was
the knife attack. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there was the attack at the synagogue in San Diego, but we see attacks
In Pittsburgh, yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's Pittsburgh, there's San Diego, there was another one. So, I mean,
Right.
but we've got churches, mosques, synagogues, and other places of worship. How did you within DOJ help teach those communities how to be safe? How did you teach them how to protect themselves? How did you help combat that kind of just violence against these communities?
Yeah, I mean, we realize that most of what we do at DOJ, we are the prosecutors. So when something awful like that happens, we pick up the pieces and prosecute. But then realizing that, we've got to do something from a public safety perspective to prevent these kinds of things from happening. So we partnered with FBI and with Homeland Security and held a number of these training seminars around the country where we got together state and local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, and then religious leaders. So whether it's a pastor or the executive director of a mosque, or different people in management of places of worship, to tell them what things to look out for, what you should be doing. So there also, for example, at Homeland Security, there are grants available to places of worship to harden their security, whether it's through video cameras and other security measures. There also are protective security advisors, PSAs at Homeland Security, who will go out and do a walkthrough. I had one come out to my church. They spend several hours going through, pointing out weaknesses, minor things you might change in terms of which doors are locked when, and flows of people and so forth, to limit everything from active shooter, which at the time was the most pressing issue, as we had this rash of it before COVID, but also things like domestic disputes, when there's custody disputes in a family, other kinds of violence that might find its way into a place of worship, and things like arson and vandalism that you need to be aware of. So there are a lot of resources out there. There's videos from FBI on run, hide, fight, and what to do with an active shooter, what things you might put in place ahead of time in terms of communications, that if there is an incident, how you're communicating it, what's your plan. When you hire a police officer who's off duty to be out front, all these kinds of things to consider.
I mean, it's amazing that we have to consider this, but it's happening more often. So it's something to, take seriously.
It's sad, but there are resources from FBI, from Homeland Security. The best resource, I think, is the DHS's Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships has a good collection on their website of the different, because I could give you an alphabet soup of DHS agencies that you're not going to remember. But the DHS Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnership has a great website that collects the various resources in the federal government that are available.
Okay, I think these are really helpful. So we will definitely add those to this interview series. So pivoting a little bit to anti-Semitism in particular.
Yeah.
We mentioned a couple of pretty horrific attacks, but in your view, it appears that there is a rise in anti-Semitism across the country and obviously around the world from my own work. What do you see as what is causing this, pushing this increase in anti-Semitism and in violent attacks in particular?
Yeah, it is sad, because if you look at the hate crime figures in the U.S., anti-Black hate crimes have been steadily decreasing for a number of years, but you see anti-Semitism going in the other direction. And part of it is that Jews have been a historic scapegoat, and it's a people latch on to old, script. You say there's a script for oppression, right? If you want to blame a victim, there's a script out there, and you pick it up, and it's about Jews. That's what we see with the organized hate groups in the U.S. It's kind of strange, this 70 years after, 80 years after World War II, that people still are, using those SS and Nazi propaganda and symbols and so forth. But that is what people latch on to. It's because it's out there. It's an easy way for people who want to hate to, pick up as I said, a script, a whole package of how to hate, and it's there. And unfortunately, Jews are the targets and the continuing victims of that.
So on a related topic, the Muslim community has also often been very much targeted, especially after September 11th. In your opinion, how can Americans who care about religious freedom help to prevent religious discrimination that might lead to violence? Like, how can we address this issue so that we don't have the mistreatment and the violence?
Yeah, I think there's just a lack of awareness out there of different faiths. One of the key indicators of whether someone has anti-Muslim bias or not is, do you know a Muslim? And people who know a Muslim have far lower rates of distrust or animus towards them. Another interesting factoid is that in America, anti-Semitism and anti-Islam sentiment correlate. So it ends up being the same types of people who are out there looking for someone to hate. Who will hate Muslims, who will hate Jews. It is not a situation like you'd imagine where, if you look at say Israel and you say, oh, it's the Muslims versus the Jews, and that's where the animus is going back and forth, and it really doesn't cut that way in the United States. It is much more likely, whether you're looking at people who are committing hate crimes or people who are engaged in discrimination, who are sort of against the other and somewhat the unknown, and whether it's a Jew or a Muslim, you end up seeing the same kind of dynamic at work.
So in looking back on your tenure as Special Counsel for Religious Discrimination, which case or issue was the most meaningful to you and why?
Ooh, there've been a lot of them. The one that I think meant the most to me was Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And that is a case where there was a mosque that wanted to locate. And I think it's a case that really sums up the work that we do at DOJ and the challenges we face in the United States currently. It just sums them up very well. So you had a community, a Muslim community that had been there for 25 to 30 years in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is near Middle Tennessee State University. There were a lot of professors who settled in the town, a lot of professionals. It had a well-integrated community in terms of economically integrated in the community, but they didn't have their own mosque. And after 25 years, they found a property. It was zoned that you could have a place of worship as of right, and the city the county did the right thing, and they approved it. But a bunch of neighbors said, "Wait a minute, we can't have Muslims moving to Murfreesboro," of course, not realizing that they've been there for 25 to 30 years and had been, they're doctors and dentists and so forth, and professors. So they started to get these stories about, why are they coming here? They're going to create some kind of terrorist training camp at this mosque, because in the plans, their permanent expansion, their long-term expansion plans included a swimming pool, because it's hot, it's Tennessee, right? And for the kids, they wanted to have a swimming pool. Oh, they're going to do underwater demolition training. It was just crazy stuff. And then they got the idea that Islam is not really a religion. The neighbors filed suit to stop this in a state court, and we're actually making the argument that Islam is not a religion, that it's actually a political ideology, but it's kind of circular because it's designed to impose Sharia law on the United States. Well, it's religious law, so it's got to be a religion, right? If they're talking about religion law, but the argument they were making was that it's not a religion, but it's a political ideology trying to impose foreign law on the United States. which was absolutely crazy to us. We at DOJ filed a brief saying that all three branches of the United States government, the executive, the Supreme Court, and the Congress have recognized that Islam is in fact a religion. That did not persuade the state court judge, who I think he ruled for us in that point, but then later on ended up at the last minute ruling against the mosque and ordering the county not to issue them their certificate of occupancy. At this point, we said, this is crazy. In fact, the imam of the mosque a year earlier had told kids in his mosque, look, this is America. These people are bringing this lawsuit, but we have a constitution. We'll be able to be in here by next summer. And we're on the verge of them not being allowed to do it. Well, we brought a lawsuit. The United States brought a lawsuit in federal court. It was the first time since the civil rights movement that we'd asked a court to do this. And this was, we asked a federal court to overrule a state court and order the county to disregard the state court judge and follow federal law. And we ended up winning on a temporary restraining order. The county was ordered to disregard the state court judge. And it was the first time since the 1960s that had happened. And so I found that very gratifying. One of the most gratifying things, though, was a story that I heard from one of the board members of the mosque. And what happened was a woman who was one of the leading opponents of the mosque was having a heart incident and went into the hospital, and the ER doctor examined her and said, I need to bring in a cardiologist. There's something serious going on here. And so he goes and gets the cardiologist. And who comes in but the president of the mosque, who's also a cardiologist. And the woman freezes and just gets very cold as he's examining her. And he ends up making a diagnosis, gives a treatment, and leaves. And the ER doctor turns to her and says, why were you so cold and rude to him? He just saved your life? And she just started crying and said, I just didn't know. I just didn't know that was what he was like. And, it really just says a lot that there was such ignorance going on that people thought, oh, here come these Muslims. They're coming to our community to do something nefarious, when they had been there all along. They wanted to come, and they'd been there, but they wanted to come together and build a proper mosque instead of the rented facility they had been in. It was basically a banquet hall that they were using as a mosque. So it was a neat case, fun to work on, and really gratifying to help some people who were really getting a raw deal.
Oh, that's amazing. And I know there's a lot of other stories that you could share, but I'm just grateful that we got to have like a little slice of it. I think I don't know anyone that's done in an hour what you've been able to do just now, Eric. So congratulations. I mean, it was so succinct and perfect, but thank you for doing that. I just, as I listen to you, I just hope that people that listen to this will begin to have a better understanding what religious liberty is all about and how it's for all of us or it's for none of us. Because when I work in different countries where certain communities are in the majority that might be in the minority here and vice versa, it's important that that they over there are willing to stand up for the minorities, and it's important for us here too. And it's important to not be afraid of other people just because they believe differently. And I think right now in our society, that's what people need to hear more than anything. And get to know people as human beings and understand them, and understand that their ability to worship is what inspires them and keeps them going. And religious liberty doesn't protect people who do bad things. It protects us to worship and to do the things that make life meaningful. So anyway, I hope that's what they take from this.
Great. Well, thank you, Tina. It's been a real pleasure.